Good evening, everyone. The time is now 6:05 p.m. I now call this meeting of the Urban Design Commission to order. Pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law and the Governor's March 15, 2020 order imposing strict limitations on the number of people that may gather in one place, as well as Mayor Curtatoni's declaration of emergency dated March 15, 2020. This meeting of the Urban Design Commission is conducted via remote participation. We will make recordings available upon request as soon as possible after the meeting. My name is Dan Bartman, and I've been designated by Planning Director Lewis to co-chair tonight's meeting in her place. With me is also Courtney Kirk, whom has been designated by the Public Space and Urban Forestry Director as tonight's other co-chair. We will start tonight with a roll call of the commission members present. Frank Valdez. I believe Frank actually just stepped to deal with an alarm going off at his workplace. Deborah Fennick.
Here.
Andrew Arbaugh.
Yeah.
Heidi Cron.
Here.
And Tim Talon.
Here.
The first item on the agenda tonight is the return of 28 Chestnut and 28 Fitchburg for their third review or their third visit. And I will promote Doug. Doug, you should be unmuted and made presenter.
Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you, and we can see a screen, but there's no presentation yet.
Okay.
And while Doug gets that up, just as a quick reminder to the commission, we have taken a vote on the chosen design option, but we have not taken a vote on any outstanding recommendations or modifications to the designs presented. So that would be our last task to move this forward.
Now, can you see my screen?
We can.
Okay. Good evening, and thank you for all the feedback to date, and we look forward to our conversation tonight. I want to just reiterate a few points before we get into the conversation. I will let you know that my colleagues from OJB have joined, and we'll go through I think a more comprehensive look at what we're doing with the site, the public realm, and the landscape design, which I know is a topic that came up last time. But our goal is, and always has been, obviously, to design a timeless building, that focuses on being, I think, sensitive to the fact that there is very little context today, but that we envision that over time there will be significant context, and that we view our responsibility as being part of building that future fabric, and doing it in a way where we recognize that our building will be a part of many buildings that will fill this neighborhood, and that we want to focus on creating a great pedestrian place. We think that the Brick Bottom neighborhood is going to be one of those neighborhoods within Somerville that is all about a kind of streetscape and the walkability and the greening of the city. And so, as I mentioned last time, we've put a lot of thought into the architecture, both in terms of its palette, its sort of scale, its respect for the kind of industrial heritage of this neighborhood, but doing it in a way that I think is intended to be subtle and focus on letting the architecture be a bit of a backdrop for the experiences that happen at the street. We also wanted to create a really efficient and compelling building for the users. We've got a lot of competition. Everybody is now trying to be the new life science destination. And so, we want to create a really compelling product that is efficient and has the characteristics that people are really looking for. And so, I appreciate your understanding of kind of what we're trying to do and our commitment to the designs that we've put in front of you. And so tonight, what we'll do is we'll present and talk about two aspects. One is the kind of the landscape design and approach, And the other one is we did go back and take a look at the penthouse. And I think a couple of different times there was some discussion around trying to create maybe a little bit more variety. We've also added some more texture and color at the street level, which is a comment that I think has been discussed at a couple of the by a couple of the members. And so we're continuing to evolve that. So please know that I think we may not have addressed all of the comments, but we're continuing to work towards integrating those as the design advances. So just first and foremost, I wanted to remind everybody that we've got two sites, 28 Chestnut, 28 Fitchburg. They're obviously a property line separating the two of those parcels. The area that's outlined by the red dot is the boundaries of the broader sites, if you will. We've talked on many occasions about the north end, opening it up, transparency, activating that corner and that open space. That future open space is obviously part of a future project. The timing is TBD, but is not part of this particular application. But know that is the same ownership team is to the north, and that is very much a part of the master plan that we're working on, and that will be an open space to the north.
Doug, this is Drew. Sorry to interrupt here. I don't think your screen is sharing appropriately.
Okay.
All right, is anybody else seeing the slides change?
Thank you, Drew.
Yeah, you might try full screen window, full screen, and that might help, Doug. Sorry.
What are you getting now?
We're getting slide 2, but it's kind of off to the side. I am seeing slide 2. Is everybody else seeing slide 2 now?
Is that better? Perfect.
All right, I think we're in business. Sorry.
No, I need the coaching. I'm not sure what you guys are seeing, so that's very helpful. Gotta love these virtual meetings. And so working with Drew, who just helped me through that, our OJB landscape partner, focusing on the opportunities to green, to begin to green this neighborhood, which is absent for the most part of any landscape. And through that, I think thinking about resiliency and thinking about the kind of creation of moments and opportunities, flow, and just again, the development of the beginning of an environment that I think is going to be one of the great neighborhoods for people to feel comfortable walking around. And so again, the focus of tonight is twofold. One is the streetscape, the landscape, first floor sort of pedestrian experience. We have put a little bit more energy on trying to think about that loading dock area and how we address that. And then again, I'll come back and talk about the penthouses and what we thought about as it relates to our investigation of those options. So with that, I'll turn it over to Drew. Go ahead.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks for everybody taking the time tonight. We're excited. We're going to show a couple slides that you've seen before, 3 of them to be exact, but in an essence of public realm. So first, looking at our district drivers, they apply to us at the street level too. Community, connectivity, resilience, wellness, activation. Those are all principles that we think we have to build upon as a district. Focused a little, obviously, on the connectivity. It is a street, so we want to make sure that the spatial relationships are very clear and it's easy to walk from point A to point B and understand the relationships between the building and the vehicle right away. Resiliency is another one that we're going to touch on. We have a pretty strong and compelling story, we feel like, about stormwater management and sustainability, so we'll kind of explain that. And a couple other of these you'll start to understand and see in some of the imagery we'll show you throughout. Next slide. When we think about the district as a whole, and Doug alluded to this a little bit, that's Levy Park's Marketplace in the top left-hand corner, and starting to think about that arts and culture and the vibe and the essence of the district, and thinking about that as a future kind of camaraderie in the district, the open studios, the arts, all those things. That's what creates the character. We want to build upon that character. And the great placemaking capabilities that are being referenced on the bottom, which is Bailey and another pocket park in New York City, those are the types of places that we start to envision populating along the streetscape and eventually throughout the district. Focused on the street tonight, we wanted to just kind of start the conversation with 3 precedents. Top right's Germany, Bottom right is Bagby Street in Houston, and then Buffalo, New York, and the medical district is off of to the left. Each one of these has a principle that we think is found, or it can be seen in our design that we're about to present to you. Buffalo definitely has that softening of the edge condition. Germany is starting to activate their sustainability spaces and put actual seating and elements that the public can start to interact with the sustainability measures a little bit more. And Bagby Street is notorious for having some of the best stormwater and collection systems out there. Looking at just the streetscape, it's a little hard to see, obviously, because we're so focused on the front, but maybe Doug, if you can zoom in on that plan for me. We're basically working from the building down. So you've got your clear zone, which is highlighted as number 1. Then we're going to start to talk about the furnishing zone, which the bikes, the lights, the landscape all falls within. We have a protected bike lane, excuse me, and then we have the parallel parking outboard of that before we hit the street. We're gonna, next slide. Breaking that down a little bit easier to digest now in section, we can kind of see it all together. And so the client has given us a 12-foot setback from the property line. That's in relation to the CI district. We are 6 feet back. Our property line is established 6 feet back from the back of curb, totaling 18-foot setback from the back of curb. Obviously, that's a great dimension to really start to do some fantastic things. So we started to look at the Somerville zoning ordinance and how can we adapt some of those scenarios and really enhance that into our site. So kind of the red arrows are bringing that into the site. You're going to start to see that the edge condition, or the edge zone, the edge condition, the little step off zone as you're kind of getting off of that bike lane, that's at 1.5 feet on our site. That furnishing zone is we're looking at 8 to 10 feet. 2 feet of that is permeable pavement on the pedestrian side as kind of a flex barrier between the clear zone and the planting zone. The planting zone does kind of start to move back and forth as well, 6 to 8 feet, some variation. It becomes a little less stagnant and a little less sterile, we think, by the movement. And then the clear zone of 8 to 10 feet is obviously exceeding the 6-foot minimum in the Somerville zoning ordinance. So that's kind of the composition or the street section that we're looking at right now. It also has ties directly to sustainability, and we'll kind of highlight those on the next slide. So looking at just site capture, thinking about that sidewalk zone, how can we shed the water from the building facade across the sidewalk and into the stormwater runoff areas, scuppers from the roadway. We do have the notion that the bike lane is protected, and that was requested with the curb right now, and we're also looking at the elevated moments too. The human comfort's a really big deal for here. Thinking about that south-facing sun of that pedestrian corridor, we want to make sure that there's enough urban forest and really a nice canopy that really helps to help that human comfort relationship. Air quality, we think of that in 2 different ways. One is from the exhaust of the actual vehicles at the ground plane. So you get that first initial exhaust, you want to get the uprising, and that's where the trees start to protect you on the other side. So really creating a barrier and protecting the health and wellness of the community as well. Slide. Kind of looking at first initial, again, we're early in the process, schematic design, starting to just think about the idea of different types of species and planting styles, something a little bit more woolly and rooted and grounded in New England kind of structural character up against the building, making sure that it doesn't get trampled and things like that, and it actually has a strong presence in the streetscape. In the actual bioswale or the bioretention planters, we think of that as obviously salt-tolerant plants, native adapted plants, species that can actually build an ecosystem and build upon a biodiversity and create a real habitat for the district. Trees, obviously, they're 2 very different styles. We think that they work together, that they create something that is a little bit different than what you're used to seeing on a streetscape, not the standard honey locust in the tree pit, but actually a substantial massing of landscape that really starts to create those habitats again. Next slide. From a materiality standpoint, similar to what our team has showed you in the past, we're obviously pulling from the district, but we also have the due diligence to represent our materials in conjunction with the architecture as well. So it's very similar, the cobbles, the Cortens, the deep red bricks, and all those types of styles and different pieces. Next. That's kind of shown here and kind of delineated by the diagram at the bottom. So your clear zone right now, we have a top cast concrete. That's an upgrade, but we do think it's something that is well regarded when it comes to accessibility standards. Obviously, Boston is only accepting of that from the accessibility standpoint, and so there's some real considerations being thought about the accessibility and the longevity of that material in the clear zone, where the predominant people will be. From there, we think we can start to tie into the cobble in front of Brick Bottom, as well as other areas in the district, whether it's a square or a rectangle, and some of those ideas are still being thought about. Building entry, we think that it needs to be signified with some kind of specialty paver, whether that be an iron spot brick or a granite paver, something that has a little more warmth and texture to it, really notating that it's a front door. And then lastly, the site features can start to represent a palette of color that is very similar or exact same to the architecture, and that's how the place starts to create itself. Next. So just real quick, we're going to start at the very end. Number one, we're going to walk you down the street towards the entry, and then we're going to take you to the street and show you the front door. So that's kind of this warm embrace. You're right at the corner of the building. We have a small pocket of a little bit more substantial planting. You're seeing kind of the vision of a man serving and kind of the action and the activity that you would see in that facade inside. On the flip side, we've got this layered approach of landscape, and it's obviously a depression too, because it has the sustainable capacity for stormwater retention. And then we have seating moments, and you can kind of see how it channels you in, and those slight deflections of the roadway we think create a lot of interest with the added dimension that we were given. Next. Kind of getting into the core of the space, you kind of see a different representation. You start to see the architecture and moments that Doug was alluding to with the Corten bands and the canopies starting to represent the same material on the architecture as our Corten rail that's protecting people from not accidentally falling into the bioretention area. Again, you're seeing that pedestrian zone that's pretty generous at that 6 to 10 feet, or the 8 to 10 feet, excuse me. And then that 2-foot permeable zone kind of gives a placemaker, right? So when you start to put the seating onto the bioretention planter and start to integrate those systems, you don't want to feel like the pedestrian zone is conflicting with that seating element. So by changing the pavement at that line, we're starting to create a sense of place in that furnishing zone as well. Next slide. And then looking at how that furnishing zone kind of expands and contracts and actually works with these planters, it gives us spaces to open it up and close it up, depending on what the relationship is of the street, but opportunities for site lighting, bike storage, and other seating elements. And then turning, kind of putting you in the street, so you get kind of the idea of arriving to the site and entering at the front door. The entry pavement is just a tad darker, a tad more substantial in nature, and a little bit more texture, so that it holds true to really establishing an entry moment. The idea that the parking is outboard, again, you're seeing that protected bike lane with the biker whizzing by, and then obviously our second building off to the right-hand side. Is everybody seeing me okay? I just got a network connection issue.
I don't know if it's here, but I hear you fine. Does everybody hear?
Sorry, Doug, you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
Okay.
Yep, I can hear you fine.
Good. Well, I'm going to turn it back over to Doug. That was perfect timing if it was an issue, but Doug, you can take it from here.
Thanks, Drew. And so the penthouse, I just wanted to remind everybody that a couple things about the CI district. One is there's no setback required, and there's actually no requirement to screen the mechanical equipment. Obviously, given the quality of the building, we've chosen to do both a setback off at Chestnut Street and fully enclose the mechanical equipment all the way around. In fact, we have a very significant setback off at Chestnut Street in the intent to try to make sure that we keep the scale of that the presence of that minimal. And so we wanted to just talk to you a little bit about, we're going to look at these buildings independently, but obviously we have a integrated deck at the end that shows them both. But right now, the makeup of the penthouse, again, intended to be fairly quiet relative to the rest of the building. We're not trying to make a big statement out of the penthouse. It's not something we want to put a lot of attention into, but we want, the opportunity, and I think Frank maybe raised this originally, was to just do maybe a subtle difference between the north building and the south building. And so here, previously we had essentially 11-foot frame, and in between that we had the corrugated, perforated, galvanized panel. What we're looking at doing is creating a little bit of a chamfer to its position so that throughout the course of the day, maybe the light catches it a little bit differently and you start to see a scaling on the 5.5-foot module. And, just again, a little bit of a dynamic presence to the top of that. The other thing I wanted to mention, now I'm dropping back down, I apologize, but I mentioned that we had made some additions and some refinements to the podium of the building. Drew picked up on it, but we're bringing in some of the warmth of the Corten material or color in these little frame elements that provide brow for these storefront entry points. And then obviously a little bit of detail with the brick, and then a better sense of what that zinc shiplap panel would look like. So you can kind of get, again, the texture and the palette, the colors of the palette really starting to come together. And of course, in the sunshades, we have that same warmth material as well. And so, it feels like, it's all coming together in a really nice composition that does provide that warmth, particularly as we get down to the street in the human layer. And then at the entry, we talked about the canopy, again, introducing, warmth at the point at which people enter. So maybe inlay of some Corten in this portal. And then there may be elements of the structure of that canopy element that we might introduce some warmth color. We may actually look at providing some wood in there on the underside in the protected area, again, to sort of bring in some more of that warmth palette in the palette. And so when you step back and look again, you can begin to see the penthouse is obviously pushed back 42 feet. There's a primary frame still at the 11 feet, but that you have the sort of scaling of the corrugated perforated panel happening in between. And so again, this is the kind of latest elevation of all the things that I think we've been working on through the course of the sessions with you. And so that's 28 Chestnut. We can go through 28 Fitchburg, and then I think we can come back and certainly talk about any of the comments. So again, here, similar orientation, similar comments. I won't make Drew have to go through this again, but I'll let you start here, Drew.
Okay.
Back?
I am here. I'm on slide 25. Site plan. It's going. Sorry. Let me shut these down. Okay, I'm here.
Are members of the commission having difficulty with the slide, or are you everybody okay?
It seems
We're
like
good. We see things.
it seems like Drew is lagging. That might be what the issue is.
Okay.
Understood. Sorry. I will keep my camera off. So hopefully that helps. Okay, so site plan number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are very similar approach to what we previously just discussed. The clear zone, it continues, the planting zone and the furnishing zone continues, and we've capitalized on 2 more planting zones, as well as splitting them open to allow some visibility into the retail. We have continued the materiality of the clear zone across the face of the loading dock, as well as the garage entry. And then we've added and really kind of try to capitalize on a much green space and clear connections at the corner, excuse me, where the bike lane ends. As you turn up that face of the building, we have a permeable parking area, as well as a green buffer between us and the building. And that will show you kind of how we are starting to think about utilizing that space for greenery. And then we also have a couple more trees before the alley extension happens along the backside of the building. Excellent.
Drew, did we lose you?
Nope, I'm here. I'm just waiting for it.
You're on your sustainable system slide because the other one was very similar to the previous deck.
Perfect. So I can keep talking then. Sustainable systems from a sectional standpoint obviously still matches the streetscape, which is represented in section BB technically. And then section CC is starting to represent another sustainable system that you're seeing for the first time, which is the permeable paving at those cobble parking stalls along the Fitchburg walk there, right there. Next slide. Okay, so next will be the planting, I believe is what everybody's seeing.
Yep.
And that is going to be the same style of planting for the streetscape. That's going to be the honey locust and the sweet bay magnolia. Really, that's about creating that two-level intervention at the streetscape, a little something different, as well as the biodiversity component of that. The green wall is being planned for along the south, or I guess the plan east face, as well as along that parking. And then the river birch is something that we feel brings the scale back down to the pedestrian. And it really starts to channel kind of what we're trying to do as a culmination of the end of that walk, where it feels like you're walking through a garden, and there's some density to those multi-stem style trees. So we'll show you kind of what we're thinking that looks like here in a second. Materiality, we went through this, but obviously it is being pulled from the district and the architecture. And then the next slide after that should be the materials.
Yep.
A little bit simpler here because we don't have any entries, but that's the only reduction. So still keeping that clear zone with the top cast concrete. Again, it gives a little more texture. It's a little new. It feels a little newer, but it still has a little bit of grit to it because there's some texture and aggregate that we can bring out to the surface. We can also get some warmth in the color of it because we can dye it. And so it's an upgrade, but it still has the accessibility requirements and kind of the thought process behind the accessibility needs of the site. Next slide, we'll outline the path or the views that we are going to take you along. So there's going to be 4 views. There's going to be starting basically from the entry, looking down towards Brick Bottom and the Artist Lofts. One will be turning around and looking back towards the entry, so you can see what that procession to the future T would look like. And then we'll show you at the corner, which was kind of like standing in the road in front of the Artist Lofts, and then one from the opposite corner at number 4 as well. The first image is looking at those Artist Lofts, like I said, and it's very similar to the original schemes or the original slides that we just kind of went through. All the dimensions are very similar: the pedestrian zone, the 2-foot curb step back, as well as the bioretention planters. You're seeing the diversity of the honey locusts and behind what we're representing as a star magnolia. So you start to understand that there's more than just street trees along this procession. Slide. The next slide is looking back towards the lobby. Again, you're seeing that how we're pulling apart the greenery and allowing for the furnishing zone to start to establish place. The bike racks, light poles, and things like that can start to fill those voids in the planting and start to activate that streetscape. You're also seeing the protected bike lane with the biker behind that. Next slide. Will take us to the corner, and this is kind of that multi-stem grove that I was trying to describe off of one image. This is a little easier. It's scaling it down so that the architecture is allowed to show itself, and it does kind of start to come up. But down at the human scale, you feel like you're transcending through a garden before you continue your journey down the streetscape. We feel like it's a nice node at the end of the street as well. Next slide, we'll finish our tour of kind of the edges, or kind of all 4 moments. And this is focused on kind of the treatment of that wall and thinking about how green walls can be utilized to start to soften some of the architectural moments, as well as just start to represent and strengthen some of the architectural moments from above, and then the gestures actually bringing it all the way down to the ground. And then lastly, what you're seeing on to the right-hand side is the notion of an east alley. And really this is about circulation behind our building for the time being, as we start to investigate the condition of that wall, the current wall on the site, and really understand that a little bit better. And we also are looking at restoring the cobblestone paving within this right away. So that concludes my part of the presentation. I'll toss it back to Doug, and I appreciate your time and look forward to discussing any comments with you all.
Thank you, Drew. And then again, back to the penthouse. Similarly, again, we have offered a significant setback both on the southern end and the Chestnut side of the building in response to, again, the scale relating to the brick bottom residence, and also I think the fact that we really want to minimize its impact along the Chestnut Street experience. And again, where we were before, we had very similar 11-foot module perforated galvanized kind of louvered system. Here, instead of the scaling, we're just doing a simple bending, maintaining the sort of 33-foot order, if you will, in terms of the frame, and then in between that, using more of a 5.5-foot panel to kind of unfolding it again, so that through the course of the day, you're getting a different light casting on the panel depending on its orientation. So again, a little bit of activity, not intending to make a big statement here, but doing something a little different on the north from the south, and then also doing something that maybe has a little bit of dynamic quality through the course of the day. And then back down to the street, again, just showing the kind of combination, the composition of the pieces, and how it starts to tie together into a rich collection of materials that we think are very much of the neighborhood. And then again, just an elevation showing you obviously the integration of the landscape, and then the sort of the subtlety. And the reason why it's obviously shown a little bit obscure is the fact that it really is pushed back, and so the presence of the elevation up to the fourth floor is really what people are going to experience. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that the East Alley, we do need to provide a setback. It's ironically the one area where we do need to provide a setback on the site. And so the current building sits at the face of the current elevation change. So in other words, the building is acting as the retaining wall. The information that we have, and I'll just sort of zoom in here, on the GLX plan this is the section that illustrates what they're doing. So the green line is running over here. These are the catenary poles that carry the power lines. They're putting fences on either side of the community path until it becomes elevated south of us. Then there's a service road that's only available to GLX maintenance crew. And then there's a zone that we hope to work with them to landscape. Our building's elevation and the top of elevation of the GLX easement, if you will, or right of way, varies. It's roughly in the kind of 10 to 12 foot range. We're going to have to rebuild this retaining wall, and we're looking at different ways of doing that for obviously aesthetics and economics and other considerations. But we do envision that we're either going to have an opportunity to work with GLX to green the right of way, which we think is really important, and make that community path as nice of an environment as possible. And that being greening between it and the green line tracks, and then maybe finding a way to green a zone here that is left outside of the service road. And then we're also thinking about how do we integrate vines and other things that are pretty tolerant that might soften that wall experience. But for the most part, it's going to be very difficult to see much of what's going on down here from up here. And so just to go back to these vignettes, we're envisioning that there may be access, maintenance access for the facade, and at the northern end there may be access into what I'll call a bike storage room that might be accessed off of that. Other than that, there's not intended to be much activity. We do need to provide fire access to be able to service this side of the building, and so we're kind of working through options and final kind of details on that that we'll be developing over the next couple of months. So that is what we have to share tonight. I'm happy to show a combined deck, or we can open it up for feedback and questions. Dan?
Would the commission like to see any graphics of the buildings side by side?
Yes.
Go ahead, Doug.
Okay, so here's them together. Again, you can see obviously the intent on the tree and the landscape was not to do, the sort of ubiquitous, equally spaced, but to create these little clustering moments with these open apertures. And then, as I mentioned, the kind of variations here, we've got the 33-foot frame with the folding perforated panels. And this is, we've got an 11-foot frame with sort of the scaled perforated panels. And then obviously seeing the landscape in its entirety. And again, just back to this area, Drew had mentioned we're pulling the textured aggregate concrete finish through here. We are inserting an island in between the parking entry and the loading entries. I'd like to see a tree here, that has a canopy high enough so that it doesn't interfere with sight lines for the cars coming out. But we're obviously spending a lot of energy trying to really soften this corner of this intersection. In support of that, this is a private way, as I think everybody knows. And I think that's it. So I'll go back to this, and maybe we can. You just let me where you'd like to go, and I'll move us around.
All right, thank you, Doug and Drew. We'll turn it over now to discussion by the board, or questions of the team the commission, or questions from the commission to the team.
Andrew, you got to help her.
I do. He has opinions too. So, no, I thank you guys for coming back. Drew, thank you for the presentation. I think the level of landscape detail is incredibly helpful. The rain gardens, the detail on that is, again, really great. I think that sets a standard for this neighborhood that will make it a lot easier as we move forward with reviewing other proposals within the same district. Just a couple things to I guess call out or question. Within the planting in the rain gardens right now, the planting is shown as not a monoculture, a lot of species diversity. I would sort of key that in as being important, that we don't want to end up with a monoculture in those spaces. I think that the tree planting strategy is also makes a lot of sense to have an overstory interspaced with understory plants. I hope as we go through this that there's an opportunity to expand that palette a little bit more, maybe have, with honey locust or whatever the overstory tree that you want to go with, you want to keep consistency, perhaps weave in a couple of different types of understory trees in the magnolia. And again, I think there can be a little bit more diversity in that species. One question that I had since we're on this slide is, what is the paving material in between the pedestrian passage and the bike lane in the great expanse to the right? Yeah, do we go, is it concrete back to asphalt, back to or is that a different colored concrete within that zone?
The intention is that's all concrete. Drew, are you there?
I am. Yeah, that's an extension of the concrete, but it's more of the, it would be more of your standard concrete so that we can still delineate the priority zone for the pedestrian.
That's great. That's what I was hoping you would say. I think the detailing of the way that the bench is intersecting with the rain garden edge looks, I know it's conceptual, but it does look nice. I greatly appreciate the effort that's gone into this portion of the landscape.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, I think I also think the green wall is really successful and a good addition to this. Between the birch turning the corner and then the green wall, I think makes a big difference. I'm curious where you might be able to incorporate an art program. I know we've talked about it a bit, and after seeing the section of the Green Line extension and the community path, that surprised me. That service lane really removes the path from the building, and that doesn't seem like there's much opportunity there. But I think as a part of the furniture, the events that happen along the sidewalk, maybe there's a way to incorporate some kind of art program, whether it's sculpture or it's something else. I think that some surprises in there, and maybe it's changing too. I don't know.
Yeah,
But I
Deborah,
think that. Pardon me?
Okay, we actually had talked about that. I know Drew was going to mention that, but the thought would be to try to create some plinths potentially inside these bioswales that would offer a platform for either fixed or rotating art.
Right. And maybe some art furniture too, just, or whatever, I think that's the kind of thing that's going to make this a memorable sidewalk experience. I think the canopy, what do you call it? The scaler at the sidewalk, that has the Corten edge, it makes a big difference. And I think some of the renderings that you're showing as clothes, for the thank you slide, or maybe the older scheme, it's a little hard to tell, but looking at that, I think it really makes a difference for the scale of the pedestrian experience. And so I do have, I like the folded, at the penthouse level, the folded corrugated. I'm curious how you're thinking about lighting the building in general and the penthouse specifically.
I don't think we're thinking about putting much light on the penthouse, Deborah, just because we don't want to make a big statement out of it. And I think the lighting on the building will be predominantly at the street level, just to make sure that there's comfortable ambient, lighting for the pedestrian. We're not right now envisioning a lot of evening lighting on the building.
Okay.
There may be, when we get to the canopy at the entry, it will include in that some downlighting to provide a pool of lighting at the front door. But our feeling is not to put a lot of attention on the body of the building and really focus on the experience at the street. Kind of really sort of from this data down, we've envisioned, maybe on the columns, the intermediate columns, you have some kind of an industrial sconce that would provide a little bit of light. And then, depending on the tenancy of the various ground level spaces, there may be additional lighting. And then within the canopy on these major structural outriggers will include some delicate downlighting. I don't know, Drew, you talked a little bit about the street lights, obviously working on setting a vocabulary for that. I apologize if I'm making everybody nauseous moving around this deck right now.
No, absolutely, Doug. Right now we're looking at ways to capitalize on one single fixture where we can do the street lighting from one side and the pedestrian lighting from the opposite side. I think some of our images represented that style of fixture, but double dipping to limit the amount of chaotic pieces and giving more meaning to a single fixture that really capitalizes on those open zones in the planting as well. Yeah, that's a great image. Perfect. Thank you.
Yes. Then just lighting up the penthouse. I don't know how open the perforation is or how much light is going to be in the penthouse space, but I think it'd be good if whatever, that it doesn't, the screen doesn't become transparent. That's where you might want to light it a little bit, but I know you don't, in terms of hierarchy, you don't want it to.
That's a great point.
You don't want to draw to it. So that was just a thought too.
Okay, thank you. Right now it's a double layered system, and we'll obviously think about that if somebody happens to kick the lights on in the winter at 4 o'clock to do some maintenance work. You're right. We're obviously we're sensitive to light pollution. We're certainly pursuing the lead points on light pollution, and we want to minimize any of that impact.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Hey, this is Heidi.
I really appreciate the additional.
Oh, Go ahead, Tim.
Go ahead, Heidi.
I was just going to say thanks to my commissioners for your comments. I really agree with everything you've said, and I really appreciate the detail that you guys have put into, the Genza Group has put into this presentation tonight. I appreciate the way that you've expressed the ground level story in a way that I think we were definitely looking for, and appreciate that you've brought some of that materiality down to that pedestrian level. It's a really nice touch. And I agree with everything everyone said so far. I wanted to ask you a little bit about any possible programming or looking at how that seating area or the area between the bioswales at the ground level, the way that that's being programmed, and just thinking a little bit about sort of what we've seen here happen in the last year with different kinds of ways of providing seating or any kind of little interventions at the ground level that might kind of break that rhythm up a little bit, make it a little bit more playful, sort of along that ground area. Yeah, where your retention planters, where you might push just having simple benches might push that a little bit further, where there might be a little pocket, I'm not sure what they're called, but I've noticed that some places have taken over parking spaces, and I understand that that's not what we're doing here. It's not what I'm talking about, but sort of a little U-shaped bench or something that's a little bit more, that's just a little bit different than just having a bench. Or also understanding that we don't know who these ground level tenants will be, if there will be any opportunity for a tenant to provide a few cafe tables out on the courtyard, or if there's something that's a little bit more, sort of if there's a coffee shop that comes in, if there's a place outside that might be a little bit more friendly to something like that.
Absolutely, Heidi. Thanks for the comments, and I appreciate them. This is a delicate balance.
Mm-hmm.
As you kind of said in your own question, is you kind of have to look at the planting, you have to look at the stormwater, you got to look at the idea of a future leasing tenant. We have requirements for bike storage on site, and we also need a place for the light poles. So right now you're kind of seeing that balance of what we think is appropriate, but it needs to evolve over time. I think your comments about the bench strategy, as well as I think Deborah, that was you as well, that the art kind of interjection of that,
Deborah,
and how
yeah,
do a little more with it, I think is a great comment for us to look at. And as far as like the tenants or the future tenants, that's very far down the road, but you're even seeing kind of the little coffee shop sign that we put in the rendering, right? And
yeah, absolutely.
We're firm believers that if you start to envision spaces that allow for those conceptually, that hopefully in the long term that they do actually come to fruition. So while we can't promise that and speak to our future tenants, we do feel that the site allows for some of those capabilities.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely. And we'll continue to track that too, because it is a delicate balance, and we'll make sure that we're trying to think about all those different aspects of what can happen in a streetscape.
Tim, did you have a comment?
Yes. Yeah, I really appreciate the refinement as well, and the additional detail you've provided in the presentation, and the additional detail in the building. I think the refinements you've made have made it a better building. You mentioned, Andrew mentioned as well about this creating a standard for the area by which we can evaluate future projects, but which will define future streetscapes. And I'm really excited about the standard that you're creating here. That's really apparent in the street section that you showed. One question just on that, with the reconfiguration of the curb, the addition of the bike lane and the planting area, have you drawn through that section all the way through the curb on the other side of the street? And I'm just curious.
Go ahead, Tim.
About the configurations of lanes and the right of way left in the street for the other side of the street, and if that's been considered.
So the extent of our interventions at this point are really the idea that we needed to look, it's a conversation with city mobility, I believe. And so we needed to look at adding the protected southbound bike lane and that's where we are right now. So kind of looking at that cross section, you see the protected southbound bike lane, you see the parallel parking, and we're looking at adding the northbound, but we kind of need to understand that a little bit more and work with the city a little bit more. So more to come on that. But I guess to answer your question, very straightforward, no, we haven't looked at the opposite side, but we anticipate similar applications as we work with city mobility.
Okay, but there may be the potential to shift and parking lists to accommodate a lane on the other side as well.
It's something to be considered.
Just another question, kind of a more detailed question, where you're showing number 6 with the protected bike lane. I think you described that as a drop-off area for the lobby there. Have you thought at all about pedestrian crossing the bike lane there and how that's treated, whether there's anything different about the bike lane?
Absolutely. We actually had a coordination call on this yesterday. We're looking at a couple different strategies. One is actually lifting up the bike lane to be flush with that arrival moment for that threshold, because it also could serve as a demounting zone. You're starting to think about people trying to get to the front door, but we need to look and strategize about where that happens along the street. Is why you're not seeing any of those updates yet. I understand where you're going with this, Tim, that it's a little strange to go up to come back, to go down to come back up to go up again, right? And it's just that we understand that condition and we're looking at ways to mitigate that.
Yeah, no, it's great that you're attuned to that and trust that you'll be able to work through it. On the building architecture, I also really appreciate the refinements to the penthouse as well. It's a really subtle difference between the two sides, but I think it'll be meaningful in creating more variation on the building, more interesting urban environment, but also meeting the intent of the zoning ordinance too. And these being two separate buildings that are similar. I was really intrigued by the section through the community path side of the building well, and the that's being created. Boy, I didn't realize that was the community path section either. That's
yeah, it's underwhelming to say the least. We are in active conversations with GLX to talk about how we might be able to contribute to greening the greenway, if you will. Understanding, they're without getting into details, they're very concerned about the public getting near trains, getting near maintenance vehicles. And so they seem to be wanting to put more barriers up than create more connectivity. But we're working through that. I think at the very least, if we offer to help green the environment, it's not about access as much as it's just softening it to the eye and to the environment.
Well, and to that end, I wonder about the alley there. If there really isn't access needed to anything in the building, have you explored just filling it in, avoiding creating the retaining wall?
It came up. We have to provide fire access to the back there for a certain dimension off the corner, and we want to provide access into the bike storage room. And so we really do think from a building maintenance perspective and other things, we're going to need to get back there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, then I guess that leads to a different idea about that. And that's maybe there's a location, or maybe there's an opportunity for art in that alley that it's, and this is completely contrary to my other statement last time, which is it ought to be something very present and obvious, but maybe it's something that is discovered. And that alley, if there is the ability, if it's not gated off, there's the ability for a pedestrian and the public to walk down there. What does that retaining wall look like? What does the face of the building look like? Is it an opportunity for some really long mural along that wall? A point of discovery in the neighborhood.
We may end up tapering, I think there's a lot of different conditions, Tim, back here, because there are two buildings that are presently acting as the retaining wall, and the actual in plan, they're not all in the same plane, if you will. So I think there's a fair amount of discovery in front of us as it relates to the condition and how we're going to mitigate that. But I think we'll take your comments into consideration as we develop it.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions, concerns from the commission? Nope, seeing shaking heads. Okay, so you have made collectively a number of recommendations tonight. The outstanding question is if any of your prior recommendations made from the previous sessions that we had still stand, and if you would like to bring any of those forward into the recommendation or just proceed with what you've provided tonight.
I would say proceed, at least for my comments, proceed with what was discussed today.
All good? Okay, so all we need is a motion to include the recommendations from tonight into the final design. Do we have a motion?
Motion to include the recommendations from tonight into the final design.
Second,
So moved by Andrew. Do we have a second? And a second by Deborah. We'll do a roll call vote. Deborah?
yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Heidi?
Yes.
And Tim?
Yes.
4-0 to include tonight's recommendations in the final recommendation for both buildings. It's really streetscape focused. So that will be, Doug, that will be essentially the recommendation for both buildings.
Great.
And that's the only two votes that you needed, the options and any final recommendation. So you will be able to advance to your second neighborhood meeting.
Great. Do you need to vote? Do you need to vote on each parcel, Dan, or is it?
Oh, I guess procedurally that would be true. So let's do this one more time. That we'll call that the 28 Chestnut vote, and we'll do it once more for 28 Fitchburg. Do we have a motion to include tonight's recommendations for 28 Fitchburg?
So moved.
Motion to include.
Heidi, seconded by Deborah. Roll call vote from Deborah.
Yes.
Andrew,
Yes.
Heidi,
Yes.
and Tim.
Yes.
Also unanimous, 4-0. Thank you for that technicality, Doug.
Thank you guys for your feedback. I think it has made a better project.
Alrighty,
Thank you.
you all are
Thanks.
free to go. Thank you,
Thank
Drew
you.
and Doug.
All right, thanks all.
If we could get, so next on the agenda is 64 Webster and 490, followed by 495 McGrath. Can I get some hands raised for presenters? There's
Four 95 Columbia, by the way.
Oh yeah, sorry, my bad. I mixed up those as results. Do you want to? Which building would you like to present first?
So then I need to recuse myself from this project.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew.
We'll present 64 Webster first, and David Enriquez will share his screen.
Alrighty. Do we need Dick and Jennifer also able unmuted, or are they presenting?
We need Dick.
As a presenter or just unmuted?
Unmuted.
Okay, he is currently unmuted. You should be able to control things on your end.
Okay, can you hear me? Great. Ready to go, Dan?
Yeah, I guess go ahead and do an intro for what these are. These is two buildings again attached. They're in definitely different zoning districts. One is MR5, and the backside you'll see a taller building that is in the high-rise district of the Boynton Yards overlay. These are similar story to the prior two buildings that we saw at Brick Bottom, in that they intend to petition the state to allow them to connect them internally.
Right. And thanks, Dan, for that. My name is Dick Galvin. I'm the president of CV Properties, and on behalf of our development partners at Columbia Realty Trust, and really our entire team, I'm pleased that we can be here tonight with all of you to introduce the project we call Boynton Gateway. Obviously, it's split into two buildings that you'll see here tonight, similar to the Brick Bottom concepts that you just saw before. But we're really excited to introduce these design concepts to you all tonight for this very important location. Obviously, this is now part of the emerging Boynton Yards sub-district, and as Dan said, has two different zoning approaches, but we think both of our designs fulfill the vision of the zoning process that took shape over the last few years. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to SGA, David Enrique. You can see here on the slide the entire project team, but obviously our friends at SGA, led by David, will focus on the presentation tonight. So, David, do you want to take it over?
Thank you, Dick. As both Dan and Dick have mentioned, this is a project that is two addresses, two building sites that are one building. So to start off both presentations, I want to go through the full site and zoning scenario. So here's our building location is on the very edge of the new Boynton Yards district, and located at Webster Ave, the corner of Columbia Street and Webster Avenue. So its position relative to Boynton Yards, relative to Cambridge and to Kendall, you can see here, and relative to the Green Line extension. So as the Boynton Yards neighborhood is being developed, as these great life science buildings are coming online and being built, Boynton Gateway sits really right, quite literally, at the entrance to this area. Union Square here, again, Inman. So it's located in a pretty significant area with respect to pedestrian traffic and with respect to the conception of pedestrian foot traffic and a lot of energy coming from Union Square into Boynton Yards. This is our development site. Currently, it's made up of several lots. We will ultimately have two lots on Columbia Street and on Webster Avenue. There's currently a private easement going through the property called Beach Avenue, and you'll see how we've included that in the planning of the building. Important to our discussion tonight is 80 Webster Avenue, which is a condominium building that is our nearest neighbor, and many of the design decisions you'll see were made in order to be a good neighbor and to create a really nice relationship between these two buildings. Here's just some images of the site. Again, the site is at the corner here of Columbia and Columbia, which is a fairly unique condition, we think, and is really exciting, and we thought a way to kind of be very generative in how that corner condition could work in the building, and also a rather important corner on the path from Union Square down Columbia, and this very really the primary pedestrian-oriented street in Somerville's conception of how these neighborhoods will develop. So that becomes a very important generator for ideas as well. Photograph A here, you can see is a low building that is part of the site that we'll be demolishing to build our building. This is the corner of Columbia and Columbia in its current condition. So there's low context, but as we said, as I said earlier, the condominium building is here, and there's a great deal of residential fabric here that we're paying close attention to in the design. So here's the zoning districts. As you can see, our building is really straddling two zoning districts, with the MR5 building here and the HR here. And this is the zoning line across the site, and you see how we really do have one building, but it's two building, but we really are conceiving of this as one building. So, I mean, I think similar to the other project, we'll see how that works, both to unify the building and to create a meaningful separation in terms of the zoning expression, the street expression. The massing of the building is limited to 70 feet in the MR5 and a maximum of 5 floors. So it really is, it does remain in this kind of commercial, it is a commercial building that 64 Webster will be, so it does remain in this kind of vocabulary of this kind of mercantile building. We think this expression of a corner contextually oriented building is really important in how we're thinking about this. Our sidewalks begin to set the parameters of the building. We are maintaining an 18-foot sidewalk, continuing from the HR zone here. So we think this is really going to be a great pedestrian zone, really wide sidewalks that, you know, really has more to do with the high-rise district, but we think it's really going to serve to emphasize this corner and really serve to emphasize the face of the building here. And we are continuing a 14-foot sidewalk here. 12 is actually required, but we wanted to make sure that there's a relationship between 80 Webster and our building to really maintain that street wall. So here's a basic idea of the massing. We are, you know, I mean, I think similar to the examples that from the zoning text, you know, we are taking the full amount of a building that we can take, which is up to this 70 feet, although we are doing it within 4 stories. And this allows us to continue a very usable floor to floor height for our lab building from the high rise into the low rise, but still maintain the kind of massing that is required in the MR5 zone. A particular facet of this commercial building is that we can only have 100-foot maximum of facade before we change to another facade expression. So we really considered that, and we started thinking about that as a way to kind of generate options, imagining how that facade could be disposed on Columbia Street, and thinking about how it starts to shape that corner really, which is going to be a very important corner when entering the district. So this is the preferred massing, which is you know, really very much an expression of the massing of the district with really no setbacks to speak of. But this starts to show how this corner becomes very significant. Our high floor to floor height, our 20-foot floor to floor height on the ground story, and a really strong corner expression of glass really starts to mark that corner. There's also the inclusion of a mechanical penthouse, which is required really for our functioning lab building, but we think it can really start to sponsor a really interesting sort of brow up here. And this is a kind of a metal sort of industrial looking kind of brow that can both create interest on the penthouse and also on the south side create a kind of a place to have a trellis for an outdoor space. So we're working on outdoor space on the roof, and we're working on sort of trying to really incorporate the mechanical penthouse into the design so that it serves to sort of emphasize that corner. The material palette that we're thinking of is, you know, it's very challenging to think about this singular building of the combined buildings, but expressing each zoning district in a different way. But we thought that this would be a great way to start including materials that perhaps you'd find in sort of a typical commercial or mercantile building on a city street. And so we were thinking that the inclusion of maybe more masonry-like materials. Here you see a terracotta, again, with this kind of channel expression integrated with it. This example was very exciting for us to think about how, again, this kind of roof trellis could start incorporating in with the larger expression. And again, here, we think that there's actually kind of a lot to draw from in the neighborhood in terms of the kind of the industrial past and the texture that could be available. And we're also thinking about, thinking of maybe how a masonry idea can be updated. So perhaps like a high performance concrete material can be a way to include a little bit more modernity into it, because we still want these buildings to relate. So we think traditional materials that express a certain modernity are going to be appropriate. So this is our preferred option. And the reason that we're thinking of it in this way is because we really like the way that this slimmer expression of the corner starts to wrap around and really starts to express itself as a building, a corner building. As you can see here, this is a 70-foot wall face of what we're calling the mid block, and a 40-foot face of the corner block. So you'll see when we start showing the building all together that this really starts to tie in a little bit more with the high-rise building, and we see this as a kind of transition. I think the story of this building really is that transitional building that comes from the lower scale to the mid-rise and then to the high-rise. So we see this sort of materially. The materials, it starts to speak to maybe more of a glass or high-tech building, but still with a kind of the rhythm and the graining and the scale elements of a mid-rise building. The corner building, we see the sort of the warmer material of the terracotta as being a much more of a traditional building, although expressed in a crisp modern way. We see that as a kind of a transitional moment across the face of the building. So this is, just sort of understanding that we're trying to create this rhythm again in the facade. So a very traditional reading of columns coming down to the ground, a traditional sign band, and really thinking about this as a really a great way to make a street in terms of traditional rhythms. But I think in other lab buildings you've probably seen the 11-foot module is really what guides us in terms of lab planning. But we think that we've been able to incorporate that 11-foot module in a way that starts to create a rhythm on the street. Again, the corner is glassier because we think that it really needs to make a statement, but then the mid block is a little bit more of the fabric that can transition to the tower. So again, this is how that reads on the corner. We think that wrapping really works in terms of that slimmer building on the end. For the alternates, we started thinking about how perhaps a darker material could start working into the facade. You see here some really more an idea of a kind of like a dark metal, again on the right, a dark metal, and how that can start to evoke a little bit more of the industrial feel, but we think it again in a modern way. And in the second alternate, it's really an 85-foot end block with this sort of transitional block in the middle. Now, this is, it's a little bit different. This is maybe hard to imagine as a separate building per se, if you were trying to imagine this as a series of buildings along a street. But we do think it creates an interesting transition between the taller building, and it allows the corner building to have a little bit more presence. So again, this is a way to sort of emphasize that corner building with really more of a kind of an interstitial moment between these two buildings. And the third was imagining sort of that darker expression being on the corner and really creating a sort of, again, maybe more of an equal 50-50 pairing between the facades. This to us really seems more like sort of a series of buildings along a street. Perhaps doesn't create enough of a hierarchy. So so this is why this didn't turn into our preferred scheme, but it is interesting in terms of how it can create kind of a more modern, edgier look. Debatable whether the edgier look is appropriate on that street, but we are studying a variety of ways of looking at this. So as I mentioned, our nearest neighbor, 80 Webster Street, is it's a residential building, so we're very cognizant of having residents as our neighbor. I explained how the sidewalks are starting to create the parameters of the building on these two edges, but on the aforementioned Beach Avenue, which is actually a private easement, but we are imagining this as an access way for our vehicular parking, and you'll see later our service and loading entrance. In the zoning, this is really a collection of two corner lots. So we have our primary front lots here and our side lots here. So technically this is sort of a zero lot line situation, but of course that wouldn't be appropriate, and we don't think it would be appropriate, and we really want to create a really nice relationship between these two buildings. So we're back of the property line 15 feet here and 30 feet from this edge to this edge. And within that zone, we really wanted to create a really great green space as a both as a kind of a visual buffer, but also as a way to emphasize this is a LEED Platinum building. Even the MR5, of course, as it's part of the whole building, will be a LEED Platinum building, but also emphasizing, I think, that the vision of a kind of an eco district. There's a lot more emphasis on green space, and so we thought this would be a really terrific way to create a really nice amenity in here, which is also sort of like this sort of pin between these two buildings that really is exciting. So I don't know if Ian Ramey is on. Our landscape.
Ian should be unmuted.
I'm here. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so I can just walk through really quickly on, obviously, we have two parcels here, two buildings, but we're approaching the public realm and the open space as a cohesive, unified public realm, although we're submitting it in two submissions. And our primary goal here really is to create, as David had mentioned, a pedestrian prioritized streetscape that really kind of sets the standard for the public realm with an activated and vibrant streetscape. This is a gateway site. It's really the first site that you encounter coming from the north, from Union Square and from the GLX. And so we want to create this well-apportioned and energetic public realm that really reflects the importance of this emerging new neighborhood. And then just to kind of focus on the landscape components around the MR5, as David mentioned, we have a 14-foot wide sidewalk on Webster Street where it abuts the MR5. This is a blow up of that shows the sidewalk condition with a corresponding section. Within that 14 feet, we have a 2-foot curb edge zone. We have a 6-foot wide furnishing zone where we have our street trees and furnishings. And then we have a 6-foot wide clear pedestrian zone up to the face of the building. The next slide. And then this is the section along what we call Columbia North. Because we're sort of respecting the facade of the HR building that's further to the east, we have an 18-foot wide sidewalk condition here. So we have the same basic cross section from the back of curb, but our pedestrian zone, our clear zone widens out to be closer to 9 to 10 feet. So it's a little bit wider section, and that sort of feels like a unified pedestrian realm across both the HR and the MR5 building. The hardscape will be a mix of unit pavers. So the furnishing zone and the curb zone would be permeable pavers, and then the clear zone would be a decorative concrete that would have some interesting pattern that kind of engages with the facade of the building. Next slide. And these are screenshots, David. I don't know if does this turn into the video, or do we just talk through this?
No, I can actually bring it up.
Okay. So this is walking along Webster and then coming down Beach Avenue, the private way, towards that open space that's behind the building and near 80 Webster. So you get an early look at the initial concepts for the open space, which has got buffer planting around the perimeter, shade trees, and then a simple central lawn panel with seating around the perimeter of that. And then as you continue, we have what we're calling a pedestrian passageway, which is an 8-foot wide hardscape with planting on either side that travels along the edge of the HR building and the 80 Webster building to the right. On the left-hand side of the high-rise, we have a green wall element that goes up for the first 20 feet or so. There'll be planting in front of that. We have bench seating and more planting, and then a property line fence basically along the 80 Webster property. And the thought there with the green wall really is to kind of make this feel like a garden walk and also provide some visual relief and interest to the folks at 80 Webster compared to the condition that they have now, which I think we have a slide of. You can see this will be quite an improvement. And the green wall wraps around the south side of the HR. And then looking back. Here's an illustrative section of how we're detailing the public sidewalk. So as I had mentioned, we have that 6-foot wide furnishing zone where we have our street trees. Within that, we're anticipating that we would have 6-foot by 6-foot tree pits. But then, of course, the growing medium for those trees to really survive and get up to the full canopy extents, we would be looking to have growing medium that would extend beyond the extents of that tree pit and below the sidewalk with a system similar to something like a Silvacell, so that we can really start to have some connectivity between the tree roots and really start to get a strong canopy going. This is the study that we did, just going back to that discussion about the passageway at 80 Webster. So the two photos in the upper left and then the black and white section on the left-hand side show the existing condition, where 80 Webster has a single-story brick building that's about 5 feet off the face of building. In some cases, those brick structures actually encroach over the property line. So it's a pretty tight condition. The two sections on the right, the colored sections A and B, get at a couple of different ways that we are trying to resolve that property line and give them a better condition. So in option A, we basically, that's the scheme that's reflected in that walkthrough where you can see the 20-foot high green wall, you can see narrow columnar trees, planting and a narrow fence. so that they're no longer looking at that brick wall 5 feet off the face. They're instead looking at that wider condition with the green wall pushed back. In option B, we studied the concept of potentially getting rid of the existing walk that's along their side and maybe giving over additional landscape to them on their property. We're still in dialogue with them, so I don't know that there's a final discussion, final resolution to that just yet, but this is what we're studying with them now. And then just some public realm precedents, early ideas of the palette of materials, the type of color ranges that we're looking at, the idea of the shared hardscape for the Beach Avenue, where you have the pedestrians and the vehicles who are entering the garage sharing the space, the idea of long flexible benches so that people can sit on them throughout the length of them, and then the idea of these kind of juxtaposed geometries in the ground plane in the hardscape, where you have different patterns that engage with each other and create more interest. And then just more depiction of that. Again, the color palette, the idea of the interesting and dynamic paving pattern, and the composition of having flexible plaza spaces that have fixed seating elements and then also movable seating elements. So there's a lot of flexibility there. And that's the type of thing that we would see being employed along the facade of the first floor level once the tenants start to get determined.
So I can move to the HR right now if you think that's appropriate.
Go ahead.
Okay. So again, I won't go through the specifics of the overall site, as I've just gone through it, sort of the macro look at where the building sits. But again, I'll reiterate, this is our MR5 64 Webster Street, and the HR is 495 Columbia Street. So again, this is we are seeing this building in terms of its context. There's a great deal of building going on that is of a higher scale, and that is of an expression of lab buildings. So this illustration gives you a sense of how this building is sitting right upon that line that separates kind of the larger building in Boynton Yards, the D3 site, even the US2 and the residential tower, which you can see in the distance. So this is really sort of right at the edge of that development. And you'll see the scale that is starting to rise up around in the neighborhood. And so we think this is kind of important to understand in terms of the context. And so here's our building, our HR building 495, sitting in right along the side there. So a lab building in the high-rise zones in the Boynton Yards overlay, we don't have height restrictions, but we do have a height which we think is appropriate, and which we think in terms of marketability, in terms of functioning of the lab building. So the building is 12 stories with a penthouse, and really the primary constraint right on our building in terms of the building is kind of the width along Columbia Street, because it's quite long, but it does maintain its 240-foot width on that side. But you'll see how that sort of begins to become part of what we're studying in terms of how we create this. So you'll see the 18-foot sidewalks in the high-rise district start to create that site constraint. The setback from 80 Webster starts to create the site restraint on the back. So we're left with what is a 100-foot, 95 to 100-foot wide building. And in terms of the functionality of this lab building in the high rise, we are looking at a side core, which gives us the appropriate depth in terms of the floor plate. And you'll see how that side core starts to express itself on the face of the building. up to the penthouse. So the massing, as we're looking at it now, again, it's a 25,000 square foot floor plate, 18-foot sidewalks, 6 stories minimum in this zone, and no height limit. So this is how it's developing according to our zoning constraints. So again, as I said, this corner starts to become an interesting moment in our project. Interesting because it is a curve in the streets, and also it really becomes kind of that linchpin between the mid-rise and the high-rise. This really starts to become a place where you enter the building. So this started to become the place where we tried to create emphasis in the facade, in the massing, and try to understand how the building is seen, sort of as you're moving west from Boynton Yards, and as the building is seen moving to the east from Webster Avenue. We're calling this massing alternate 2. This is actually preserving the curve, but we do feel that although this could be interesting, it could be a little unrelenting and really occupying this corner. And we really think that we want to carve back the building at this corner and create public space. So another factor is our pass-through under the building, that the Beach Ave pass-through. And we see that as a way to generate form as well. So again, massing alternate 2, we're starting to look at carving this building back at this moment and starting to create a little more angularity and to create a kind of height in the middle and stepping down towards the side. Although this does maintain the 240-foot distance, we also felt that it was still preserving a little bit too long and wide a face on the eastern facade. So we understand that breaking down the massing is really critical. We don't want to have too large, too much bigness, too much of a face on that building. So we felt it was really important that even though we are taller than everything around, it's still a mid-rise building. It shouldn't be too large and too blank. So we took the opportunity to add yet another sort of step back in the massing and in a way tie that back into our pass-through under the building. And so thinking of all of these kind of generative moments as a way to tie them all together and create a composition that we think works in terms of creating a really strong emphasis on the corner, working in the pass-through into the composition, and then we think really sort of making a much more interesting penthouse area. So again, this is a very quick series of diagrams showing how we're starting to think about moving through the building. Now, to back up, the Beach Avenue it's a private access easement, but we do have requirements that we allow our neighbors, as they are a party to that, access through. So we do have to maintain that. But we saw that that plus the requirement that loading be done off of an alley, we saw that as a way to, again, generate form and to start thinking about how we could creatively solve these problems. So we are moving through the building, but then that starts to set up the more active ground floor uses on Columbia North, as we'll call it, which is really the pedestrian street that's seen as this east-west connection, and creating a space in the rear of the building that's really more service-oriented, where we can maintain as much activity as possible through the MR5 building, through the HR, all the way to the entry, and then sort of relegate a lot of the service uses to the back here. So we think it's taken sort of a challenging set of restrictions on the site, but then use it to generate what we think is an exciting form. again, here are the alternates. And sort of the base case of the curve. So this is how we're seeing the preferred massing. We're seeing a taller form as sort of like a slab sort of coming up all the way up through the penthouse and cutting across, and then we're seeing these other pieces of the massing sort of coming in and holding that. And then of course that sets up our corner condition here. Because we do have really large faces to the east, and we are seeking to differentiate, I think, that large center piece of the massing from the other pieces. We saw sort of this idea of a frame language as a way to start to think about how to break down the scale, because again, we're starting to use that again, the sort of horizontal graining in the MR5 building. And we thought that bringing that through into the lab building was appropriate as a way to break down the scale. But we sort of changed the floor-to-floor reading and start to understand it being expressed in a little bit more of a sort of a high-rise lab, a little bit more of a modern expression. So our preferred option, again, we're maintaining this as a little bit more of a crisp curtain wall expression. And on the sides, we start to bring in this frame language in a way to sort of hold it in the setting. And you'll see when we see these together that we start to get a lot of resonance across the whole street in terms of the datum of sort of the first floor and the sign band. The ground floor is still maintains what we think appropriately is really more of a two-story expression. I think emphasis was placed on that in the zoning, since this is a 12-story building, to sort of differentiate it in terms of height. But again, as you can see here, we still maintain that sort of sign band datum that's tying these buildings together. And this comes across then and really starts to set up our entry. You know, we're imagining a lot of a really active lobby with potentially food and beverage or some coffee in here, and something that's really exciting out onto the street. Not sure about the program yet of the other ground floor spaces, but we do see this as kind of fulfilling that vision of an exciting pedestrian-oriented ground floor. You'll see that the canopy then comes across and sort of marks the moment where that pass-through happens. We're still studying how we want to express this, but we do know that you know, this is a functioning lab building. We are going to have loading functions in here, and even though this does allow movement under the building, we are not necessarily emphasizing it as a pedestrian way. We think the pedestrians will come in from the 64 Webster side, and then potentially around down that pedestrian walkway that Ian was referring to, so you can sort of move around the building. So we understand that it's challenging to have this open space under the building and still maintain the security that we need for our tenants. But that's certainly a focus of the design right now for us. So again, large frames, double story frames, kind of breaking down the largeness of this facade, the massing sort of integrating together to create the layering of the penthouse beyond this penthouse. And then you'll see as we go around the building, we're actually thinking of bringing some more interesting materiality into the penthouse that begins on the side on the western facing side. That's essentially sort of our inner lot line, but we know this is going to have visibility from the street. So, and in addition, it's going to be facing our neighbors. So we do want to create a little bit more interesting materiality. This is our, this is our core. So we're sort of, we're challenged with having to integrate that core into the building. So we think that it does provide an opportunity to bring that up and around and to really sort of start to lock these masses in. We're showing green walls here as well. This is sort of the elevation of the walkthrough that Ian was walking you through. So this, again, this kind of panels that we can start to think about integrating light in and start integrating potentially art. We think that this entire ground floor is going to be probably a combination of storefront and green and design and potentially art as well. So in terms of our alternatives, the first is really sort of it is an expansion on the theme of the frames, but we wanted to see what it would be like to not have that center, to have that center wall be all a crisp expression, but rather bring the frames throughout the building to really further break down the scale. We think that there's potentially something exciting in this. Although we also sort of run the risk of maybe overdoing it, but we thought we owed it to our design to sort of take a look at that as well, and we think that this could potentially be something exciting as well, depending how we handle it, whether it's a different material or not, to sort of set it off. But we think that sort of creating a heavier graining on the sides would really create more of maybe a sense of solidity in here, and then we can sort of play with the story-to-story expression of this to sort of create a little bit more height in the center. For our second alternate, we are thinking of something completely different. In fact, we're thinking of really a combination of metal panel and glass, but doing it in a way where we start shifting, and this could potentially bring in some of this cementitious panels that could be really interesting, have a really cool texture to them, and we think that this could potentially be a way to break down the scale as well. So we're always trying to understand how we can make it an interesting facade. We didn't have a tremendous amount of ability to play with the massing, so we think we've done what we can to kind of create an interesting massing within, sort of 5-foot setbacks. But we think that the skin again can start playing that role in terms of like sort of moving the eye around and changing the reading of the face of the building. So this is another exploration of how that could happen as we start to sort of stagger these moments in the skin. The really strong verticality of this, while interesting, we think also may start to emphasize the height a little bit too much. So this is why this wasn't our preferred scheme. We still think that the horizontality is probably helping us more in that regard. And we've gone through the public realm already, so I won't do that again. But we do have these presentations sort of with everything in them. And then we see really how we start to combine these schemes together. And as I was saying before, I think this sort of really strong horizontal right at the ground floor starts to create the public realm that we're excited about, all the way around the building, all the way from the corner of Webster Avenue, and we think creating another interesting corner on the other side of the building really gets has an exciting moment coming and going, as it were. So we really think that this is starting to pull together. You start to see that this is what it is. It is in fact the bright line between these two zoning districts. These buildings do have to read differently, but I think in terms of how we start to create horizontal readings across We think that we're tying it together. We do think it, it feels like a street and not just one gigantic building. So I think we're pretty excited about how this is coming together. And I also have a model if we need to spin around it, but yeah, and that's our presentation.
All right, thank you, David and Ian. For the commissioners, there's a lot of content here and a number of votes that we'll have to take. I'm curious whether or not you would like to just ask open-ended questions at first before we methodically go through all that stuff. Okay.
Yeah. Dan, I have a couple clarifying questions. Regarding zoning, so it's the MR5 and the HR district. Is this applying the Boynton Yards overlay district as well? Is that? So this would be a contributing building. The high-rise building is within the Boynton Yards overlay district and utilizing its standards. So it would require a contributing lot special permit. It also has a standard has a civic space requirement that they are proposing to buy out of. So it's subject to the standards of the Boynton Yards overlay district, while the MR5 building is utilizing actually the base zoning district outside of the overlay. Okay. And so that's permitted by the overlay district, and so they're buying out of the civic space requirement in full?
That is the intent, I believe.
Okay. And then regarding some of the other requirements, the Boynton Yards overlay, art and civic space requirements, community center requirements, are those applicable as well?
The community center is only required of master planned area development. Since this is a contributing lot, that's the avenue for individual buildings to be produced on sites that don't have enough land or sites to achieve all of the master plan standards. So they're utilizing the avenue for building one building essentially used inside the overlay district. So it only requires civic space if there's an allowed in lieu payment by special permit and there is no community center requirement.
Okay. But the arts and creative space requirements, that still would apply at 10%?
It's 5%.
Okay. Thank you.
So I have a couple of questions. It was a long presentation, and so I may have missed some of this stuff, but I'm curious how you get into the building. Is there a door from Webster Street that gets into the main part of the high-rise section, or is it all from the corner of Columbia and Columbia, or is there something I missed? And also, I'd love to see the long Columbia face. You might have showed it earlier, but I need a refresher on it.
Yes, this is the building actually has two lobbies. The main lobby is here at Columbia and Columbia, where you find your core elements, right? And so this is sort of at that carve back in the building that starts to create sort of more of a public space here. And there is another lobby on Webster Avenue. So there'll be a smaller lobby at Webster Avenue, and they'll connect through. And we're sort of exploring ways now how to make that exciting, whether it's an art gallery space or some other kind of interesting design. But we are imagining that this has a little bit more an intimate feel, a little bit more industrial, in keeping with kind of the graining of the building and the reading of the materials. And then again, this would be I think still in the let's say updated industrial look, but a little grander and a little bit more modern in its look. So again, we're always having to sort of understand how these buildings work separately and together, but this is how we're imagining it. There's also a moment in the plan here where you can get out, and we'll have bike storage, bike facilities on this part of the building, but you'll be able to walk again through that lovely green space and get into the building here. So so there's a variety of ways that you move through the ground floor and through this lobby. We're kind of excited, and if depending on how we explore sort of lobby activation in terms of a cafe or so forth in this moment in the plan, that will be able to have sort of both visibility in and out at this moment, but then also it'll be part of this world as you move in and out.
And is the intent to have most of that section of the building have retail or some kind of lease, commercial lease space? So it's a
Yes,
garage access.
Everything that's facing the street here will be a tenant.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, unknown at this moment, but that's seen as activating that face of the building.
Yeah. And then what do you see as the primary access to the site in general? So what, which entry is going to have a little more pressure in terms of folks that approach it, other than those that are parking in the building? I assume there's parking. I see parking access, garage access. So I imagine there's a certain amount of parking.
Two garage levels below the building.
Okay.
And the garage will be accessed off of Webster Avenue, and also exited on Webster Avenue. So you won't be, traffic will not be coming through this area except for loading service and potentially 80 Webster tenants who may need to go through here. But we really want to preserve this zone with the courtyard and the green space as much as possible as a pedestrian-friendly area.
Mm-hmm. And primary access, like access from the Green Line, from the Union Station, and other, bike or pedestrian, routes.
Yeah, predominantly from this position, from the upper right-hand corner. Mm-hmm. This is coming south on Webster Avenue, so this is coming from the extension of the Green Line and from Union Square. So you'll be finding that corner that we talked about on the MR5, and then you'd be turning down Columbia. And as you move back again from Boynton Yards, this is how we're imagining a lot of traffic coming. Then this will be the primary corner that you see. But we do imagine that the way we've kind of expressed the canopy and expressed the corner, that this is really going to be a very lively part of the building.
And you had a wider sidewalk along that section, didn't you?
Correct. Yeah, we have 18 foot required for the high rise, but then it's also I think we're as much as at least 24 feet here or more.
Mm-hmm. And then can you show, maybe just run around the elevations? I don't know if my colleagues mind me. Just sort of run through the chosen, or the recommended, I should say, the recommended approach.
For the combined one at the end, David?
Yeah.
Oh, you want to do, okay. Sorry. So this is the Columbia North elevation.
Okay.
All right. The high rise, 12-story high rise.
Mm-hmm.
And we think emphasizing that corner building is interesting, making it appear a little slimmer. And you see in terms of the tone of the building, materiality and the tone, and even now some of the rhythm of the mid block, we see really as a way to transition to the high rise, but still maintain the look of a separate building, and especially even the way that the building comes down to the ground, and it's really sort of standing right next to what appears to be another building.
and then turn to the Columbia, the other Columbia, the long face. That's, I guess, what I feel like.
If it helps, I can use this.
Okay. Okay.
So you can see here, we're also starting to think about incorporating a green wall into the face of the building here. We know that, you know, the fact that we're really putting a lot of our emphasis of our ground floor on this side of the building to emphasize the pedestrian street. We know that, you know, that the really a lot of the functions of the building, a lot of the back of house functions of the buildings will occur in here. So we're not going to have a lot of glass or opening at this point. So we wanted to, you know, create a lot more interest. And so we think continuing a lot of that green wall on the exterior of this building is going to be kind of exciting. And, you know, I think it's going to get great light on this side of the building as well.
And then the view from Webster, you know, sort of seeing the building behind the, and, you know, I couldn't tell whether the core area was solid in your recommendation.
The core area is solid. It is solid,
okay.
but we're, you know, we're emphasizing that this is going to be sort of a more textured material, sort of if not, you know, something that evokes masonry, if not masonry. But you know, we're thinking that the interventions on the ground floor with respect to that green space that we walked you through, and the way that it sort of ties in with the massing of the building in general, we think is more dynamic than, you know, you might imagine for a solid face. I mean, I think that the truth of the matter is that this is really sort of the back of our building, in a zoning scenario where there were other buildings of our like, you probably wouldn't notice as much, but we understand that it's going to be seen. So we think we've tried to solve it in an interesting way by tying it into the penthouse and creating a sort of interlocking facade.
Okay, seeing this model was really helpful. Thank you. So should we make comments? Do we want to have other questions and then make comments? Like Heidi.
Let's do additional questions in general first.
Okay.
Yeah, you guys covered all my questions actually. And so it would be great if we could jump into the materiality and the facade and just talking a little bit about how this relates to the rest of the neighborhood. And again, it was a really great presentation, a ton of information and a lot of materials. And so I wanted to talk about a few things, and if there's anything that I've missed that you talked about earlier in the presentation, please just speak up. And so just in terms, I know we're going to be asked at the end of this meeting to decide on a facade direction. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that currently, and just to hear maybe a little bit more about your preferred option, because I'm kind of a little bit leaning towards option 2, and I'm going to tell you why, because there's a few things that are going on here that I'm wondering if are appropriate for the scale of the current scale of the neighborhood, and knowing that, you know, when I imagine this district, I imagine it developing in a kind of a similar way that Kendall Square developed, where there's like a ton of residential that's been there for a very long time, and then starting to build up this kind of lab fabric in the neighborhood, and the way that some of those buildings I think are successful and the other ones are probably less successful. And I feel like there's that one of the most successful buildings in that scenario have looked at having more of like a podium and then the building above, so that those ground floor or the first few stories can start to speak a little bit more to the fabric of the neighborhood. And so when I'm looking at this, I'm wondering if it might make sense to go more towards option 2, where you're bringing that brick more around and starting to really sort of have a dialogue with the industrial nature of the neighborhood, but also with the residential nature of it. And then I'm wondering, and I also kind of like that narrow, it was this one.
Yeah.
That kind of narrow sliver at the back where you're celebrating both buildings now. You're celebrating the low rise, medium rise building, and you're also starting to celebrate the high rise building. And I feel like we don't need to be shy about that high rise. Like I like the idea of kind of celebrating the verticality of it, but there might be a way to think about the podium. Maybe that's the way you connect the two buildings together materially, where you have more of those darker materials, or maybe a little bit of brick or something around the first floor, maybe the second floor, however it ends up working in terms of scale, to kind of scale down the lower portion of the building to make it more appropriate for the neighborhood, and then really celebrating the high-rise building above with some of those more vertical members. And those were kind of my early thoughts about this, where just in terms of the scale, I do feel like I really appreciate the horizontal work that you're doing. I don't feel like it's bad to celebrate the vertical work, but just breaking it up in a way that makes it a little bit more appropriate for the existing urban fabric. I don't know how. I love that you're doing this like lobby, this kind of strong move with your lobby and strong move with the ground floor, and I think that that'll have a lot of meaning to this neighborhood. There are probably going to be people that are a little bit grumpy about having a high rise built in their neighborhood, and so just thinking about that, thinking about the way that the way that lobby is going to be kind of seen by people, I think is like, it's great the way you guys are thinking about it. And just to think about it like materially, and maybe in terms of scale, a little bit more like part of the fabric of this neighborhood might be beneficial. And I definitely agree in terms of the building massing. I agree with the scheme that you're going with, where you're I really appreciate how you guys showed your work and the way that you were thinking about the way that you were doing the massing for this. And I think you came out in the right place in terms of like breaking up the facade a little bit. Again, I think that the scale of it works a little bit better that way, rather than having that curve, which I forget what the word that you used was, but it wasn't aggressive, but it was, I don't remember, but I agree that having that, sorry?
Was it relentless?
Relentless, that's what it was, yeah. It was a little bit relentless, I agree with that. And so I think you guys are really heading in the right direction. I think that there's another pass on materials and kind of how you deal with the podium that might make this sort of resonate a little bit more for the neighborhood. And then also the way that you're connecting it to the landscaping. And again, like I really, really appreciate the level of landscaping thought that you guys brought to this meeting in terms of the sections that you showed and the materials that you're showing, and how you're looking to make this into a place that's really great for your neighbors and bring some greenscape into it and so forth that they don't have right now. And as the building develops and the podium develops, I just wonder if there's a way to relate them a little bit more strongly in terms of patterning on the sidewalk, where you place the trees. And that's something that can evolve as we go along. But just in terms of, I mean, there's another way to go, which is that you make it you make it just completely separate from the building too, which is certainly a strong concept. And so maybe the way that you have it now, I think, is very nice. I'm not sure what the design purpose of it is, if you will, or what it's kind of relating to back into the main design of the building, or if you mean it to be very separate and then it kind of goes in maybe a stronger separate direction. I'm not sure yet, but I think that that'll become more apparent as the building evolves.
Yeah, so Heidi, I totally agree with you about option 2. That was the first thing I was going to say about this. I feel like there wasn't, and for the reasons that you said, but I also feel like that dark facade, it didn't have enough frame, repetition of frame to work on that short side. And I also like the slot, and that becomes the transition to the tall building.
Yeah.
So completely on the same page. And actually, I think your podium concept is similar to where I was going to go also with thinking about the experience along the street. And the fact that the street that we're looking at right here is really the majority of people are going to come along that. I think you really need to think about it as, I think you need to show that the experience along that side of Columbia, the first part of Columbia.
Yeah.
And you know, and it does feel, especially when you get to the tall building, it feels like it's trying to, the lobby is trying to draw from basically from the delivery side, as opposed to from the Webster Street approach side. And, you know, and I think that I just don't think the base is strong enough. I mean, that's what, Heidi, I think what you were sort of referring to is about developing a stronger podium. Yeah, and so this whole experience along here, I guess that, so that canopy, that the canopy band that starts off at the delivery, you know, the what is that, the easement area. I really wish it had a stronger emphasis towards Webster Street, and you're really creating place. You know, that's where it's deep. That's where, you know, there, and maybe it's a little higher than 12 feet, and I don't quite know what that means, you know, but it's, you know, more than it's 1.5 bays or something like that. It just doesn't feel scaled, given the height of the building. It doesn't feel scaled correctly. I mean, maybe 1.5 is getting a little too tall, but it doesn't have it doesn't have the presence along the street to create public realm and to define where entry is. It seems right now it seems very hard to find, you know, the entry from primary points of access. So those are, and you know, it feels pretty harsh at the corner. Maybe that's where it's round. By the way, you know, and I agree with the massing. I think you know, the ones that you studied, I feel like you landed on the right one in the expression of this. And I think the counterpoint really to what you're trying to do with the Webster's, the mid-rise building, you know, which is more, I think, impactful and better composed, you know, with alternate too. And I think when you were flying around the building, you were on the easement side of the building, and there I think you had that darker terracotta and dark frame returned all the way to the high-rise building, I think.
Yeah.
And I think it's much more successful, you know, so I think, yeah, go for it, you know, let it capture that building. Right now it feels proportionately, it doesn't feel as successful as the option 2. Yeah, so it goes right in. I mean, and maybe that doesn't quite go all the way in, you know, maybe that slot it registers on this side also. And I think the entry from Webster Street is, you know, needs some development. It's not very strong, but as you know, you look, I think at that whole ground plane from Webster around to Columbia to the easement, but sort of forcefully stopping at the, you know, at the entry corner, I think really needs a lot of study here. But otherwise, I feel like this is, you know, the rest of the building and the proportions of the frame that you've developed for the high rise are pretty successful. And I sort of,
yeah, I agree with the comment.
Yeah. Oh,
Go
just
ahead,
really quickly
Deborah.
about the landscape. I loved, you know, before you described the building, I was going to say I loved the what I call the geometric Copacabana beach, you know, dark and light. I lived in Brazil for a while, so I love that sidewalk. And I feel like this really, I love the way it captures the whole site, but I agree, it doesn't, it's not quite a strong enough counterpoint based on the, you know, the scheme that's developing here. But I do find it, I like the way it, I like the scale of it in this neighborhood. And maybe it changes scales a little bit from Webster. And then when you get to the, you know, the other side, you know, it's just slightly tighter, or something about it is scaled down, you know, as we get to Webster Street. But I do think I do like it as a gesture, and I think the landscape also is going to make a big difference. The green, hopefully the green walls will will survive. But I think this neighborhood does have some successful green walls in the area. I'm done, Tim.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of good feedback there, much of which I agree with. The scale of the podium, I think on its own, from a street level view, it feels comfortable and it feels right, but in proportion to the overall size of this building, it does feel diminutive and perhaps undersized. I have a number of comments about the architecture, but I just wanted to step back a little and talk about the streetscapes maybe first. For Columbia Street, I know today it's a tough street, just about everyone, for a pedestrian, for a bicyclist, probably for a driver too. Does this assume that the curb is staying in the same location? And so is that 18 feet measured to the existing curb? I'm wondering if there's a plan as part of a broader plan for Boynton Yards, character Columbia Street, the whole thing, the whole section.
It is based on the current curb.
Okay. So I think that's
our across the street, the neighbor across the street at D3 will be developing the other side of the street. And maybe Dan can speak to this as well, but that was a question we had about how this is being distributed, but we are taking it from the current curb line.
So that's a concern, and maybe it falls to you as the first mover here to really understand the character of that street. But in terms of connectivity within Boynton Yards, I know a lot of effort's gone into getting the bicycle lanes on Webster and planning for those. I'm worried that there isn't going to be connectivity into and through Boynton Yards unless we're planning Columbia Street for bicycle facilities now, and really thinking about that whole section, not just from the curb end, but the whole thing. And that may change that section, that 18 feet, where the building wants to be.
Yeah, currently the street, I believe, is 26 feet. The paved area is 26 feet wide.
Okay. So I think I would like to see additional detail about the street as well. And maybe Dan, if you know anything more about planning for that street.
I can tell you that it is a true statement that they will be splitting improvements to Columbia and the intersections in and around the building between themselves and US2, who will be developing D3. So we expect one side of the street to be improved by each building. I don't have an answer yet about the curb radii, for instance, where Columbia and Columbia meet. For everybody's future reference, the internal street that DLJ is building between these two gray buildings you can see in the background on this image was just recently named Archibald Query Way after the inventor of fluff. And there's a chance that that street extends the entire way, so there's a chance that these two segments get renamed. They actually have different names at the moment, making this one straight line segment have three different street names, which you can understand us trying to clear up. So while some of those questions are outstanding, we're still working with the Mobility Division to figure out will the intersection of Columbia and Columbia be realigned a little bit so that there's tighter curb radii, and exactly what style of bike facility might be built here. Is it all on one side? Is it on either side? I know that the Mobility Division is working towards getting curb separated cycle tracks wherever they can. And that's the only update I have with me at the moment, but we can get more feedback from Mobility.
Yeah, I think that would, thank you, Dan. I think that is important to define, and maybe it's not as part of this review process, but as part of the review process for this building and the siting of the building. In terms of the overall height, I want to clarify, I think certainly I just want to recognize the significance of this building in the surrounding neighborhood and in Somerville, really. This will be the tallest building, I think, in Somerville outside of Assembly Row. I think that height, well, certainly something, we're the Urban Design Commission, and height is certainly a big component of urban design. But that height is part of the way this area is zoned. Boynton Yards is zoned for unlimited height, which allows for that. In terms of the building architecture, I guess maybe starting at the ground floor, I have some concerns about the ground floor, maybe going around the building, especially the application of the green walls on 3 different sides of the building. There is a green wall on the side of the parking garage that exists today on the south side, and it's very successful. There's vines going up multiple stories. It grows, but it has 100% solar exposure. It is true southern exposure. I think what you're showing here is green walls on the kind of east, the south, and the west side, and especially on the east, in between a very tall building and an existing building. So I'm concerned about the real viability of that wall over time, really on the east and west side, but especially on the west. And there's a lot of blank wall on the ground floor of this building. And I know that's dictated by program, and there's programmatic requirements for service spaces and other things like that. But it's a lot of blank wall on the ground floor in an area that you correctly described as something that is going to be very active for pedestrians. And this is a gateway building into Somerville's new downtown district. So I'd like some further development of the ground floor, both of the blank walls and really looking at what the opportunities are there. And I think of the bike parking at the corner. Does that really need to be in a room with no transparency, with no natural light in it? That could be a great opportunity to open up that corner and do something really expressive within the bike room, really dynamic, wall graph, who knows what it is. But something very exciting there. And I think on the north side as well, your kind of retail street on Columbia, we just saw a project that showed a very well-defined and developed ground floor, very well-articulated ground floor. And I think there's kind of a level of detail that isn't quite there yet. I mean, big picture-wise, yes, that is the place to locate retail and to have an active storefront. But I think there's a lot more development of that facade that I'd like to see because it's an important one. In terms of the core, I think you've correctly identified this, what we're looking at right now, is a gateway corner. But I feel like it isn't quite enough yet, what you're doing there to meet a gateway corner. Perhaps even more so than the side, the Columbia curve, this corner really is the gateway into Boynton Yards, and a really significant transition in scale from a 3-story, 4-story residential neighborhood to a 12-story commercial district. It's a significant transition. And yes, there's more glazing at this corner than on the rest of the facade, but it feels actually kind of similar. You have a glazed corner on the other side as well, kind of turning the corner on each. It's a very similar treatment, and I wonder. I don't think this massing is inevitable. It doesn't need to come out and square the corner. I'd like to see additional options to really make this an expressive gateway corner into Boynton Yards, because I think it's that important. In terms of the facade options, I think option 2 is probably preferable to option 3, but the architect, I wonder. I took a read through the MR5 design guidelines, and there's a lot of, I think, good input in there about vertical bay spacing. And I think the intent is really to, in part, I mean, there's a lot of intents, but to achieve a vertical bay spacing and kind of a regular rhythm across along the street that creates a sense of scale. And I think it's undermined a bit by these horizontal bands of different scales that carry through both of the facades. And I wonder if the verticals want to carry through instead of the horizontal to create a more regular rhythm and break that scale down a little more. I was intrigued by the scheme with the slot building as well. It seems somehow, to express the separation a little more between the MR5 building and the high-rise building, that these are 2 different districts. But I wonder whether it all needs to be in plane. Is it possible for it to push in a little more and to achieve a little more variation in the massing? And maybe I'll stop there. I have a few comments on the high rise too, in case anyone else wants to jump in.
I wanted to make sure that we talk about the courtyard. I appreciate that there was a really nice video about the space, and I think sort of seeing the walkthrough of the courtyard space, it starts to open up a lot of questions for me about the relationship between the courtyard and the abutting residential property. And, you know, certain moves like the fencing, you know, is that something that the neighbors wanted? Or, you know, it really looks like the picnic benches are almost up against someone's windows. You know, I start to question some of the design characteristics about what does it mean to have this amenity that is kind of part of their public way, but then it's fenced off. So I don't know. I feel very I'm not sure if this is communicating that this is the space that's only going to be used by the lab building, or if it's intended to also be an amenity for the residential building. I think that there's some massaging that has to happen about some of the edges, and I appreciated some of the precedent studies that you showed that, I don't know, maybe included some more organic forms. I think that this looks very, in plan, it almost looks like there was a swimming pool and then it's turned into a lawn. So I don't know, I feel like there could be some massaging around this courtyard that could go a long way. And, you know, maybe it's the abundance of the Carl Forrester grass used in the model. I don't know. I just have a lot of questions about the courtyard.
Any other comments from the commission? Tim, I don't want to lose your high-rise comments if you'd like to review them.
Sure. I guess on the high rise, I feel like there's perhaps a kind of another level of detail that I'd like to see about them. I'm not feeling like I could make a decision yet on a preferred option between the three. And especially option 3 that you had showed with the rounded corner coming around Columbia. I'd be interested in seeing some additional views of that, some additional development of that. I think this is going to be a building that's seen from a lot of different places in Somerville and some important civic places, from Union Square Plaza, from Prospect Hill Park, from Lincoln Park, from other places. Wonder, as part of this, is the evaluation of different options, whether we could see some views from some of these important civic spaces around the city. And some additional kind of detail on the materiality of I think a couple of times you mentioned things like evoking the idea of masonry, or perhaps actual masonry. I mean, I'd like to know whether it's actual masonry or whether what the material is. I also wonder whether you know, understanding that there's going to be a solid side of the building on the west where the core is, and that perhaps the idea of into the core is a way of giving it, you know, some type of definition, but whether that's really it feels like an opportunity that isn't quite there yet. It's a big solid side of the building that be really visible from the surrounding neighborhood, and I think some thought really needs to be given to the articulation of that and what it is and what the materiality is. And I guess the last comment would be on the penthouse too. from the ground, again, in a building of this nature, the penthouse is such a significant part of the building, especially when seen from a distance. So I think as you're considering the west side and the solid side of the building and what that can be, I really think of the penthouse as an opportunity for, another opportunity for architectural expression at the top and visual interest. If you read the planning document, the neighborhood plan, Union Square neighborhood plan, and even the zoning, there's a lot of discussion about creating an interesting skyline for Boynton Yards and for Somerville. The penthouse is going to be a really big part of that. And yeah.
Great. I'm writing
I guess
furiously.
actually I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm taking this down. Thank you. No, these are great comments. Really appreciate it. I mean, I think it's always good when you hear the questions you've had running around in your head being repeated by other designers. This is certainly, I think the development of the ground floor is going to be very important, and we certainly need to add more detail to that. So I think comments from each of you regarding that are well taken. It's something we're very much aware of. I also agree with, we've also been sort of trying to understand this. I mean, this is a 20-foot floor-to-floor ground story, so it's certainly not low, but I think in proportion to the rest of the building, it has been appearing to sit a little bit low. So I think explorations in how we get that reading a little more two-story is really a great comment, because that's certainly something that I think we need to do.
Any other comments from the commission? None
Just
at this
maybe
time.
a question. Have you?
Sure.
Yeah, just a question. I mean, I'm curious. Have you explored this in physical model? Have you been working through digital model?
We haven't explored this through physical model, no.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. If you had, if you would have certainly been something I would have been interested in seeing, and I think would really help with the evaluation of the building. I'm not sure if the Urban Design Commission in the past has asked for physical models to be created, and certainly it's a challenge in the time of COVID. But again, for a building of this significance, and especially with understanding the relationship between this building and the adjacent residential building, that may be very helpful, not just for the process of this commission, but with neighborhood meetings and then with the planning board as well.
So each of these individual buildings needs at least 3 votes. I've heard a lot of requests for some refinement and additional information. Is it the will of commission to take any votes? Let's address 64 Webster. Is there any direction that you'd like to provide related to the facade options? I don't want to presume any answers on your behalf.
I feel like we all lean towards option 2. I believe it was option 2 that has the slot building in the back.
That's right.
Yeah, yes, out of the 3 that have been presented, but I'd like to see additional refinement of perhaps that is the starting point, but addressing this corner in particular before we make a decision.
Yeah, I would like to. I'd like to see that corner studied also. If it's sort of a dematerialized corner, and not that it has to have a vertical emphasis to it, but it is just not, I don't think it's doing what it needs to do as a gateway, as a transition threshold kind of experience here.
So I guess one of the questions to ask is if you would want to see refinements to all three, or if using option 2 is Tim, I believe you called it a starting point.
I would agree.
I would feel
with that.
comfortable. Yeah, I would feel comfortable with scheme 2 being the starting point. And looking at the corner and also the entry also on that, on Webster.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. And just to clarify, scheme 2 is the slot building, is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
This one.
Yeah, I
so
would agree with that. Though,
okay,
I'm just gonna, sorry to go on, but I'm just gonna add one more comment to that. I think as you look at the kind of refinements to this, think about how these different pieces are coming together and meeting each other too. I think that's gonna be really important as well.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what do you call it, the ground, the height of the sidewalk captured zone along the base of the building needs to be a consistent height. I'm not sure it doesn't transform a little bit as it gets to the high rise. It might be a little lower in the Webster side and then jump up a little bit, but that's, I think, something that needs study again with the studies of the experience along Columbia, that first section of Columbia.
So if I'm to channel what I believe I'm hearing, the desire is to pursue option 2, but to potentially not take a vote because you'd like to see these refinements made to it. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah.
Okay. So that would also mean final decision about the design guidelines for this specific proposal would also need to wait until the refinements come forward, along with any kind of final feedback that you might all have, which would only leave a motion to continue this to a future meeting date for them to incorporate this feedback and represent. Do we have such a motion?
So moved.
From Tim. Seconded by Deborah. Let's do a roll call, Deborah.
Yes.
Heidi.
Yes.
And Tim.
Yes.
That is a unanimous 3-0 for continuing this to have the feedback provided today incorporated into a revision and presented at an upcoming regularly scheduled meeting. And then we'll address 495 Columbia, the high-rise building. I'm sensing a similar feedback. Would like to see additional information, additional graphics of potentially all three options for the massing. Is that correct? Tim,
Yeah, I don't feel comfortable. Yeah, I personally don't feel comfortable with that direction yet.
I believe maybe perhaps for the design team's sake, all of those options were all on one slide, and it might be helpful to see blow-ups of those, like as big as this image is shown for that whole side of the building. So that could be helpful for when they return.
Agree.
I'm sorry, Dan, that for each facade option, for each massing option.
I believe you had all massing options, but there were suggested facade designs for each one of those.
Yes.
and those were all three depicted on one slide. So that essentially the imagery was small. And by chance, maybe the commission would like to see elevations of both Columbia and Columbia of each of these, just to get a closer up view. Is that fair, Tim?
Yeah, I think so. And sorry, yeah, I'm off mute. Yeah, so I think that's right, Dan. And I guess I'd also say I wouldn't restrict yourself to just refining these three options. I mean, I think there's been a lot of feedback, good feedback given tonight about the building and its location, how it sits here. I think I encourage you to pursue that fully.
All right. So do we have a similar motion to continue to the next regularly scheduled meeting or a future regularly scheduled meeting?
So moved.
Second.
All right. And seconded by Heidi. Do we have a roll call vote? Deborah,
Yes.
Heidi,
Yes.
and Tim?
Yes.
All right. That is a unanimous vote, 3-0, to continue to a future regularly scheduled meeting. David and the rest of the design team, we will have a video available by tomorrow, along with our own summary of what the commission said, which we can compare to your notes and do a follow-up meeting to prepare for your return.
Okay.
All righty. Thank you very much for presenting tonight, and we will see you at a follow-up meeting.
All right. Thanks for your feedback.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate it so much. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Good night.
That is the end of the business we have on the agenda tonight. So if there's nothing further, we can entertain a motion to adjourn.
I make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Do we have a second? Seconded by Heidi. We'll do a roll call. Deborah,
Yes.
Heidi,
Yes.
and Tim.
Yes.
Unanimous 3-0. The time is now 8:41 and we are adjourned. Thank you very much, commissioners.
Thank you.
Hey, good night, everybody.
Have a
Good night.
have a good evening.
Yeah, you too. Thanks. Bye.